Stay free with Russell Brand. See it first on Rumble.
I want to sort of follow up on that idea that, you know, are we witnessing the end of American empire, or are we beginning to see the conjugating of American empire with a new type of unipolar globalism as exerted through organizations like World Bank, NATO, obviously, WEF, WHO, these organizations that are to some degree funded by American taxpayers, but also funded by private organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, do have the ability to transcend national democracy and implement law. We're seeing that sort of, you know, throughout the pandemic. We're seeing examples of that, and there's currently a treaty being debated that might demonstrate it even more clearly. So I suppose what I'm asking you is this. It sounds like one of the things you were saying is that nations like China and Russia, while they are clearly militaristic nations with great interest in empire, with their own transgressions and genocides even as part of their past, and persecution as part of their present, are at least willing to contend with the idea of a multipolar world in a way that the unipolar, globalist, expansionist, current American military hegemonic idea is not accepting as a possibility, that they want global dominance. Because when you said that thing, mate, that there is no, you can't conceive of what would be the objective in Ukraine. That's why it has to be presented in simplistic terms. Oh, it's a humanitarian disaster. We've got to present Ukrainian people. Zelensky's a hero. Putin's a monster. It doesn't take into account the obvious truth that Russia is an enormous, powerful country with a rich history. This is not something that can just be wiped off the map, with no disrespect to a country like Iraq and its previous historical incarnations. And that was a country that, you know, that there was such an obvious distinction in the scale and size and the difference between the capacities of both nations. And we've seen the horrible consequences of that botched war. So the consequences of this one could be immeasurable. So a few things I want to touch on: unipolarism, American expansionism, the true agenda of fucking hell, you're going to be talking the rest of your life, China and Russia. And also, I really like the way you keep referring to class throughout this. I know that some of that's because of your personal and familial history, but I guess when we get to the crunch of all this, we see which people are expendable. We get into that Foucaultian idea of who is it okay to kill, whose lives can we dispense with. And it seems now we're saying, once again, American lives. There are certain American lives that can be traded. So I'd love to pass the ball back over to you.
Well, you're right to raise what they are seeking is a unipolar world, but that's been slipping away from them very quickly with the industrial might of China. I mean, what happens in war is that once you open that Pandora's box, it just goes in all sorts of directions you can't predict. So, for instance, somebody in Washington gets this loony idea that they're going to arm the moderate rebels. And just I want to remind viewers that I spent 7 years in the Middle East. This is an area I know well. So they pump in $500 million worth of weaponry. Well, of course, all the jihadists from Iraq cross the border and are rearmed. And then Washington freaks out and starts bombing the very people they armed and acting, in essence, as Assad's de facto Air Force. And we should note that thousands of Hezbollah fighters from southern Lebanon are also fighting on behalf of Assad, so we're acting as Hezbollah's Air Force. I mean, this is what happens in war. And so what with the conflict in Ukraine and the staggering and obscene amounts of money, and I was at the February 19th rally in Washington with this left-right alliance that denounced permanent war. Ron Paul was there, and Jimmy Dore, and a bunch of other people. But what happens with that is that they pushed Moscow into the arms of Beijing. Now, the whole Cold War policy was to make sure that Beijing and Moscow were closer to Washington than they were to each other. This was a fundamental tenet of Cold War policy, that you did not want a strong alliance between Russia and China, which I think is probably one of the reasons that Henry Kissinger, a man I loathe, of course, but he correctly spoke out against the perpetuation of the war in Ukraine. And Kissinger said, again correctly, that you don't want to attempt to humiliate Russia, a nuclear-armed Russia. And the constant escalation, which, to be clear, is being driven by NATO countries, is essentially panic. It is an understanding that however much Russia bleeds, and Russia has clearly bled a lot, the longer this goes on, the longer the infrastructure of Ukraine is degraded. I think roughly 50% of Ukrainians do not have access, or at least permanent access to, excuse me, electricity. That they're finished, and so that's why you're seeing weapons being sent to Ukraine that they're not going to be able to even effectively use. They're just throwing everything they have at it. And the idea, of course, with the sanctions was to destroy the Russian economy. Well, the economies that got destroyed are the German economy. What's UK inflation is almost 10% in it. I mean, your energy bills have gone through the roof, putting even more pressure on a distressed working class. I mean, this is a very cynical war, because it is not being fought for Ukraine. It's being fought partly to enrich the arms industry, but also it's being fought to degrade the Russian military. That's really why it's being fought with Ukrainian bodies. But the economic price, of course, the price in terms of devastation and loss of life, is being paid by Ukrainians and Russians. But the economic cost is being borne by Europe, not so much by the United States, which is fine with the United States because it forces Germany to buy their natural gas, which was probably part of the plan all along. There was an old saying, which I think is true: you can't talk about war if you don't talk about markets. So the breakdown of the unipolar world, especially with the rise of China, is what, and you mentioned the IMF and the World Bank, and these are institutions that cemented that dominance, American dominance, for decades around the globe, and of course destroyed local economies so that corporations could come in and seize them, which, by the way, they did in Russia under Yeltsin. That's why the IMF gave Yeltsin a $10 billion loan, of which an estimated $1.5 billion was spent to make sure he was reelected, because he did Washington's bidding, which in the end gave rise to the nationalists around Putin, because that we turned through Yeltsin, who was a fall-down drunk. We were turning Russia into a client state with devastating impact for Russian people. I mean, bread lines and hunger and everything else. So yes, what they're seeking is, and historians call it micro-militarism. It's where late empire engages in military adventurism in a desperate bid to reclaim a past dominance. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, anybody, even from the outside, can see the social unraveling in the United States, the mass, the opioid crisis that takes 100,000 lives a year, but that doesn't count the millions of people who are addicted, the fact that half the country doesn't even have $400 in their bank account to handle an emergency expense, the collapse of our healthcare system, of all the industrialized worlds. We did the worst job of handling the pandemic. I think we had 16% of the global deaths, and we're less than 5% of the world's population. The incursion of the Capitol on January 6th, you can see the social disintegration and the very rapacious and lethal force of, as I mentioned before, these militarized police that function as internal armies of occupation. The stripping away of, I mean, we are the most spied upon, watched, monitored, photographed population in human history. And I was in East Germany. I covered the Stasi state. So the unraveling internally and the increasing loss of global hegemony is, you are right, is what they're attempting to do is use this massive military machine to reclaim it. But look at what happened in Iraq. We lost the Taliban. We lost the war to the Taliban. Everything we touched, Libya, Syria, Pakistan, Somalia, has been a disaster. And the longer this war goes on, the more it's assured that Ukraine will be a disaster too.
Chris,
And then, of course, they'll turn to China.